for joining. On behalf of the Thirdhand Smoke Resource Center, I'd like to welcome you on behalf of our director, Georg Matt, and the co-directors, Rachel Record and myself, I'm Heather Whipfley, as well as our project manager, Lydia Greiner, and as well as our staff and our affiliated faculty as well. So just a little bit about the center. The center is part of the California Thirdhand Smoke Resource Consortium, which is funded by the Tobacco-Related Disease Research Program in California. The consortium is a multi-institutional and interdisciplinary collaboration involving research groups from the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, the San Diego State University, University of California, Riverside, University of California, San Francisco, and the University of Southern California. So our center disseminates the consortium's translational research and thirdhand smoke knowledge to stakeholders and the public. So this is a really typical activity that our center would do, is holding a webinar with important stakeholders, including property managers throughout the state. The learning objectives for today are to discuss the, the effects of thirdhand smoke on people and on property, and also describe the development, implementation, and enforcement of city regulations that prevent thirdhand smoke in multi-unit housing. Also to describe the development, implementation, and enforcement of a property management policy that prevents thirdhand smoke in multi-unit housing. Finally, we're going to discuss together strategies to overcome resistance to regulatory and policy challenges that prevent thirdhand smoke in multi-unit housing. And we're going to provide you with some resources and to help owners and managers of multi-unit housing prevent thirdhand smoke in their properties. So again, we have a packed agenda. We have 3 speakers as well as an additional discussant. And we want to spend lots of time really on our discussion. So again, I'm going to jump right over to our speakers. And just really quickly before I go on, I wanted to make sure to announce that we have no conflicts of interest for any of our speakers involved in the presentation today. Okay, so our first speaker will be Dr. Georg Matt. Dr. Matt is a professor of psychology in the College of Sciences at San Diego State University and the director of the Thirdhand Smoke Resource Center. His research focuses on human exposure to tobacco smoke toxicants in real-world field settings and on strategies to protect non-smokers from the exposure to tobacco smoke toxicants from secondhand and thirdhand smoke. So I'm going to go ahead and turn over control to you, Dr. Matt, and so that you can share your slides.
Thank you. Let me go into presentation mode here. Greetings from San Diego, where we are at the tail end of a heat wave. And I hope you can see my slides. Here we go. So I'm going to get us started. And want to give you some background based on the research we've been conducting over the last 20 years, research conducted in chemistry labs and biology labs, but also lots of research conducted out in the community, in family homes, in multi-unit housing, in cars, and hotels. And as you will see, we've learned a lot about thirdhand smoke over the years, and so we feel it is time to share this research with the general public and make sure that everybody understands why this is something to be taken seriously. So I'll talk about what is thirdhand smoke, where it comes from, how does one get exposed, how does thirdhand smoke affect an indoor environment and its occupants, how widespread thirdhand smoke is in multi-unit housing, and what we can do about it. So secondhand smoke is the precursor of thirdhand smoke. And when we started this research, nobody really referred to thirdhand smoke. This was called stale tobacco smoke or cold tobacco smoke. But as you will see, thirdhand smoke has not so much to do with smoke, but with the chemical residue that's left behind. So secondhand smoke is the precursor of thirdhand smoke. Secondhand smoke, of course, is generated by burning and smoldering the tobacco plant, the various additives that are in tobacco, as well as the paper. Secondhand smoke is composed of just about 15% of the exhaled mainstream smoke, what comes out of the lungs of smokers, and the vast majority is side stream smoke. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because side stream smoke, the smoldering smoke, is much more toxic than the mainstream smoke because it burns at a lower temperature and leaves incomplete combustion products at the end. In combination, what looks like this mysterious smoke is actually a very complex mixture of more than 6,000 different chemical compounds, including volatile gases, molecules that float around very quickly and spread throughout space, but also fine and ultrafine particles. And if you followed the COVID-19 science a little bit, you know that you know about particles, also known as aerosols or droplets. So these are superfine droplets that can stay up in the air for long periods of time, that can squeeze through all kind of openings, under doors, into cabinets, and so forth. Secondhand smoke very rapidly spreads throughout an entire room, an entire house, neighboring apartments, and outdoor spaces. It remains in the air while smoking takes place, of course, as it's newly generated, but for, let's say, 10 minutes to maybe 3 hours afterwards, depending on the air exchanges and ventilation. So as the secondhand smoke slowly but surely disappears from the air, what happens to those 6,000 plus chemical compounds that make up that mysterious smoke? Well, within seconds of lighting a cigarette, or for that matter, other plant products, including the marijuana plant, for instance, these secondhand smoke gases stick on surfaces and are being soaked up by materials. And when I say soaked up, I want you to imagine a dry sponge that soaks up chemical compounds from the environment. So secondhand smoke particles and droplets, they deposit, they settle, they accumulate on surfaces, they settle out in house dust. The secondhand smoke gases and particles become embedded as they are being absorbed and soaked up by these materials. Now, once they're there, they're not just resting there and staying put, they undergo further chemical reactions. And by doing so, they can create novel chemical compounds that were not found in tobacco smoke, including some rather potent carcinogens. And they can form additional new particles that then can be released in the air. So I'm going to give you a little animation here to show you what happens. Let me introduce you to apartment 605. There's a baby, there's a cat, there are toys, there's carpet, there's furniture. And as tobacco smoke is being generated, maybe in a neighboring room, maybe in a neighboring apartment, this secondhand smoke spreads throughout the apartment, and it starts absorbing, depositing on surfaces. Now, as this smoking continues over multiple times a day, over days, over weeks, and perhaps over years, this repeats itself many, many times. And the secondhand smoke touches upon all the surfaces that you can see here, including surfaces that you may not see, such as the backing of a carpet or the backside of these curtains or inside the upholstery of the sofa. Over time, these compounds accumulate. Sometimes you can see this in a discoloration. Sometimes you cannot, but over time, the discoloration is inevitable. And then perhaps the smoking stops. So what happens when the secondhand smoke disappears? Well, the thirdhand smoke remains. From these deposits, thirdhand smoke is being re-emitted. This is the off-gassing that we can sometimes smell. The particles are being resuspended. Furniture, the carpeting, the floors, the toys. Now add to this some of the chemicals that are in the ambient air, such as ozone and nitric acids or other oxidants, and new compounds are being generated that are being added onto the already existing compounds here. So here's a more scientific definition of what is thirdhand smoke. And to help us remember what it is, we've called it the 4R definition here. Thirdhand smoke is a persistent and toxic mixture of tobacco smoke pollutants that remains on surfaces, in dust, becomes embedded in objects. It becomes embedded in ceiling tiles and insulation materials, furniture, wallboard. You can find it everywhere on the outside as well as the inside of materials. From there, it can be re-emitted. That is, it off-gases into the air, these volatile compounds, and this is what creates the experience of stale tobacco smoke. Not always, but many times when an indoor environment has reached close to a saturation point. From these reservoirs, fine and ultrafine particulate matter droplets can be resuspended, and these existing the compounds that have absorbed into these reservoirs can react with other oxygens. So this is our 4R definition. Now I want to show you a bunch of pictures, and since you are in the apartment management sector, you can, I'm sure, relate to some of these. Here is number one, an apartment or a house actually that has been smoked in for a long period of time. You can see the discoloration, you can see the stains, but it is not just this visible outside part, something that perhaps could be washed off. This cannot just be washed off because it has penetrated into the material, into the carpet and the carpet backing and the doors and the drywall and the ceiling tiles, everything that's visible and much of what's not visible here. Here are some dishes that were kept in a closet, in a cupboard in an apartment just like this. You see the discoloration. You also see that this fine particulate matter, these droplets that float through the air, they find their ways through the closed doors of a cupboard. Here we see some of the residue that can be washed off with just a little bit of water, but as it's being washed off, the reservoir underneath will replenish what we can see on the outside. Here's the sofa, and if I close my eyes, I can already smell it. But this is a piece of furniture where you can imagine that the upholstery inside, the foam upholstery, provides a huge amount, a huge volume of for storing some of these compounds. Of course, it's not just furniture, it's toys, it's blankets, it's clothes. Here is someone who has come to the realization that tobacco smoke not only stinks, but it sticks to you. And this does not just include the clothes, this includes the skin, the hair, the hands. If you are an art lover, I'm sure you've seen pictures that are discolored. Some of this discoloration, some of the residue is likely to be tobacco smoke. This is what a dentist might see as evidence of thirdhand smoke in the mouth of a smoker. And if you've been a smoker or if you know smokers, you know that smokers often have these discolored fingers. That is thirdhand smoke as well. So how does one get exposed to thirdhand smoke, as a non-smoker especially? Well, thirdhand smoke exposure results from contact with these pollutants in the air, that is through inhalation, in dust, that can be through ingestion, on surfaces, by touching, as they become embedded in materials. So we're talking about inhalation of pollutants similar to secondhand smoke, but in addition to inhalation, we also have to deal with ingestion, a particular issue with small children, but also with adults, as well as dermal contact, skin contact with polluted surfaces. adverse health effects of these third-hand smoke chemicals. And I want to distinguish here between acute or short-term exposure, let's say exposure in terms of minutes and maybe hours, and chronic exposure. So acute exposure has been associated with, and I'm sure if you have been in such environments, you can attest to this. There are a variety of respiratory symptoms, including shortness of breath, asthma severity, asthma attacks, allergic skin reactions, headaches, earaches, cardiovascular symptoms, eye and throat irritations. But what is more of concern to us is chronic long-term exposure. And this is what happens if a home is polluted with third-hand smoke after perhaps a previous tenant smoked in it for a long period of time. Chronic exposure can lead to DNA damage. It's been shown in human cells as well as in animal models. It can affect the immune system and immune response. It can interfere in children, especially with the organ development. It can cause metabolomic changes in reproductive cells. It can affect body mass, liver function, wound healing. That has been demonstrated in mice. Third-hand smoke is found in homes of non-smokers who move into smoker apartments, live in multi-unit housing where other residents currently smoke in neighboring apartments or shared spaces. It also found in multi-unit housing where others may have been allowed to smoke just years ago. I want to show with you data from a recent study that we've conducted here in San Diego in multi-unit housing of 220 units. You see on the horizontal axis, the x-axis, the 220 homes that we've ranked ordered from low to high levels of third-hand smoke. And on the vertical axis, the y-axis, we have surface nicotine concentration from really very small amounts. Think of it as a kind of Lego block amounts, all the way to very high amounts. Think of this really as the Rocky Mountains and the Himalayas. This is really the range of differences that we found here. We have in blue the non-smokers, non-users with smoking bans, both light and dark blue, difference being that the dark blue may have been exposed to secondhand smoke outside. Then we have in orange and red users with ban and then users without bans. We have at about 1.6 micrograms per square meter, the average that we found in non-smoker homes with smoking bans from previous studies. So this is kind of the average background level. You can see that we found in every home we found tobacco smoke residue, but the levels up to this are, reasonably small, perhaps that we may not have to worry too much about it. Then at 30 micrograms, we have based on previous studies, the levels that we find in smoker homes where indoor smoking is taking place. So of the non-smoker units, 10% of these non-smoker units, non-smokers with smoking bans, we find third-hand smoke levels similar to or higher than what we find in smoker homes. In about 5% of these non-smoker units, we find levels that exceed those that we find in smoker hotel rooms from previous studies. And in about 2% of the homes, we find levels that we've previously only seen as averages in a smoker casino. So this gives you a sense of how widespread is third-hand smoke pollution at significant levels. So we might be talking about here in San Diego in the neighborhood, perhaps between 5 and 10% of units that currently house non-smokers. I want to tell you a little bit about a few of these participants with very high levels. So here is someone with 200 micrograms per square meter, a non-smoker with a smoking ban who lived in this apartment for 10 years. This shows you how persistent this residue can be. Another participant here, a non-smoker who moved in 2 years ago. Here is someone who has been in an apartment for 10 years, now a non-smoker, but the wife used to smoke quite a bit. She passed away 3.5 years ago. And then the highest level that we found, a someone who currently is a non-smoker, has not smoked for 9 years, but used to smoke. This is residue that is extremely persistent and can be persistent for a long period of time. What can we do about it? Number one, prevention. And this is what the following presentations will be about. We need well-implemented comprehensive smoking bans. They need preparation, education, buy-in, monitoring, compliance checks, and most likely counseling as well. Remediation is an option if we can identify the polluted apartments, the polluted units. There currently is no standard effective cleaning protocol. The benefits, as we've studied them, are often temporary because the reservoirs often remain and the outside is being cleaned. There's a wide range of possible repairs and costs associated with this, and the overall success depends on the level of thirdhand smoke pollution and the depth of these reservoirs. So for us right now, the focus is really on prevention. And with this, I'm ending my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Matt. I'm going to go ahead and skip through to our next speaker, who, excuse me about this. Quick review, got this all quick. All right, our next speaker is Rebecca De Rodriguez. Rebecca is the program director for the City of Berkeley's Public Health Division Tobacco Prevention Program. She has worked in public health and wellness for the last 20 years and specifically in tobacco control for 9 years. Rebecca's expertise lie in community development, social justice, youth development, sexual and reproductive health, early childhood education, case management, tobacco cessation, facilitation, and training. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing this and share another file for her. Let's see here. Okay, let me put it into presenter mode. There you go. Rebecca, you're on.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thanks everyone for having me today. I am from the City of Berkeley's Public Health Division, and today I'm going to be giving you an overview for our smoke-free multi-unit housing policy that went into effect in May of 2014 and is currently effective in Berkeley. Do I have slide control? Or do you? Because I'm not able to forward the slide.
I do, but for some reason it's not going. There we go.
Okay. So our tobacco prevention program for the city encompasses many things: coordination, collaboration, education, technical assistance, and these are some of the things that our program focuses on. And today we're focusing on the administrative implementation and support we give our code enforcement within our city manager's office when it comes to our smoke-free multi-unit housing ordinance. So one of the things that we look at is our health status report, which is a public health division publishes every 7 years. And so what we found was pretty consistent data that had an increased amount of hospitalizations for children birth to 4 when it came to asthma. And so when you're thinking about secondhand smoke specifically, it is one of the triggers when it comes to asthma attacks. And it's also one of the top reasons for school absenteeism. So that was one of the equity lenses we were looking at. Not only was this affecting birth to 4-year-olds, but it was affecting, as you can see from this graph, African Americans specifically at the highest level when looking at the data. Next slide, please. So when looking at the geography of Berkeley, we wanted to look at the zip codes for children under the age of 5. So here you'll see the most hospitalizations happening in Berkeley related to asthma for birth to 5. Those hospitalization zip codes we're looking at are in West Berkeley and Southwest Berkeley, which has the most people of color, specifically Black African American, and Latino residents in Berkeley. Next slide, please. So when thinking about the rationale, the reasoning for the ordinance, we believe and we know that there's no safe level of exposure to secondhand or third-hand smoke for that matter. Secondhand smoke travels between units. What we do know is multi-unit housing properties share more than 60% of the same air. So if you are if you're in one or more units, you are sharing more than half of the amount of air between units. And secondhand smoke, again, is a key asthma trigger. And I highlighted some data when it came to children. Next slide, please. So when it took us 8 years to come up with this ordinance for a rent-controlled city. We collaborated with our our Department of Economic Development for the city of Berkeley. We also are a rent-controlled city, and we have a rent board, so we partner with them as well. Property managers. We also partners with renters and tenants and condo owners, because this also applies to condominiums as well. So we had a partnership with a variety of people for a number of years to get it right and what would fit best for Berkeley. So when thinking about sending out notices, when we did finally come up with our smoke-free multi-unit housing ordinance, this is a timeline of how we partnered with property owners. So in March, landlords were mandated to provide notice of the ordinance requirement to all existing tenants. So whether they were new or they already had a month-to-month or a year lease that was established within the last year, this smoke-free multi-ordinance applied to them. So it was really important for landlords and property owners to express that information to their existing tenants. And then in May of 2014, the landlords were mandated to provide a notice of the ordinance requirements at tenant application. So they needed to inform all new tenants that this was a law in Berkeley. There was no smoking in the multi-unit housing site, essentially, anywhere on the property. And I'll get more into detail about that. And then in May of that year, we mandated a disclosure of the ordinance requirement in all condominium sale contracts. So again, it applies to condominiums as well. Next slide, please. So enforcement. Our enforcement is a code enforcement program through our city manager's office. So the city enforces this particular ordinance. We're one of 3 public health jurisdictions of the state. Usually they're county specific, but we're one of 3 in the state that are city established. So it's Long Beach, Pasadena, and Berkeley. So that's unique to us. And city enforcement is how we do that. And then we also have the lease clause. So initial leases will have the mandatory non-smoking clause in it. And existing leases could voluntarily reestablish their leases. We didn't promote people to do that because we didn't want people to be at risk of increasing their rent necessarily by renegotiating their lease. But there was an option where we did give addendum language for the no smoking current ordinance. Next slide. So between the implementation between the years of 2014 to 2016, we wanted to make sure that we're being thoughtful for many people, but specifically for the residents and for the property owners. So I gave you a little of how we gave technical assistance to property owners to let their residents know what the new law was in Berkeley. Between 2014 and 2016, we increased our free stop smoking services that we provided to Berkeley residents. We did outreach and education with multi-unit housing residents. So we did presentations in lobbies in apartments. We also presented to condo associations. We presented to property owners as well, Chamber of Commerce. And then we also provided a sample lease language for property owners. So we did not recommend, the council did not recommend mandating remediation, defining smoking as a nuisance, or requiring a registry of units with non-smoking lease clauses. So those are things that we did not include in our ordinance. Next slide. So what we did What they wanted to look at is mandating disclosure of units without non-smoking lease clause, and allowing tenants to break the lease without penalty if the landlord fails to include non-smoking clause or notify of smoking units. But we didn't feel these were no longer necessary because smoking is prohibited in all units, and the city is responsible for enforcement. So the landlords don't necessarily have a role in enforcing this particular ordinance. Next slide. So very briefly, our smoke-free multi-unit housing ordinance prohibits all smoking in multi-unit housing, includes balconies, patios, decks, includes common areas also like mailboxes, anywhere basically on the property. You cannot expose people to secondhand smoke or vape. We also offer cessation classes twice a year, free to anyone who could come to them in Berkeley. And we require all new leases to have the non-smoking clause that I was referring to earlier. Next slide. And this is specifically our ordinance. If you want to look through it there, but it basically gives you more detail of what I just had an overview of. Yeah. Next slide. So this is very briefly going over our process. It's a complaint form process that needs to be submitted by a resident of a multi-unit housing site. The first complaint form that's submitted completely is sent to our office. We process it. We send a warning letter to the alleged violator at that multi-unit housing site. We also confirm with the person who submitted the complaint form that we're processing it. And information, if given, is also sent to the landlord or property manager, so they're aware that there's an alleged violation in their property, on their property by a resident. Next slide, please. The second complaint form, so our process specifically is we need 2 complaint forms from 2 unique addresses in 6 months of each other. So once we receive the first complete complaint form through our office, it starts a 6-month timeline. Within that timeline, if we receive a second completed complaint form from another unit from the same multi-unit housing site, that fulfills the requirements for possible enforcement. So what we do is we forward that to the code enforcement department, and it's under their discretion how they investigate, and that could include an infraction, which is basically a ticket. Next slide, please. And that is my presentation. It's a quick overview of our smoke-free multi-unit housing ordinance for the city of Berkeley. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And so I'm going to share and back. Sorry about this. I'm having to control too many, things all at once here. All right, so our next speaker is Jennifer McKinney. Jennifer is responsible for the administration of various affordable housing programs, as well as the day-to-day maintenance operations for more than 2,000 units of affordable housing owned by the San Diego Housing Commission. A smoke-free policy was implemented at the San Diego Housing Commission in 2014. So I'm going to go ahead and let Jennifer take over.
Thank you, Heather. You're a great driver. Give me just a moment here, bring up my talking points. So good afternoon, everyone. As Heather said, my name is Jennifer McKinney. I am the Vice President of Real Estate Operations here at the San Diego Housing Commission, and I'm just thrilled to be here today to share our success in preventing third-hand smoking impacts. So the Housing Commission went smoke-free in 2014 in an effort to provide healthier homes, but we also had a business case. We wanted to improve our bottom line. Before I delve into all the details about how we implemented the smoke-free program here, I want to take just a few minutes to share a little bit of context about the Housing Commission properties and our policy. So as Heather mentioned, the Housing Commission is a provider of affordable housing in the city of San Diego. We have a really diverse portfolio here, including single family homes, we have duplexes, we own a hotel for low-income San Diegans, And we also operate garden style communities, which I'm sure many of you property managers are familiar with. The majority of our housing is deed restricted at 80% of area median income levels, which equates to an adjusted household income of about $92,000 annually for a household of 4. We operate the portfolio using best practices from the private sector, and like so many other owners, we count on the revenue here to fund operating expenses and other programs here. And the only reason I mentioned the context behind our portfolio is because a lot of folks don't see us as traditional owners or operators of multifamily housing. However, I assure you we are. I also want to point out that our properties are scattered throughout the city of San Diego, which is an operational challenge for us in terms of enforcement. We don't have management offices or oversight at every single community every day. And I'm bringing all of this up because I feel that if we can do that, if we can implement such a policy, any owner or management company can. Thank you. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the Housing Commission adopted a smoke-free policy in 2014. It took about 2 years from the point in time it was merely an idea to full-fledged implementation, not necessarily because it took that long, but there were competing priorities. Going back in time a little bit more, HUD had issued guidance to public housing authorities, which we are, in 2009 to go smoke-free. And although less than 10% of our own portfolio is deemed public housing, leadership felt that there was tremendous value in going smoke-free at all of our properties. So in other words, this was not a mandate for us, but a deliberate choice. In 2011, the County of San Diego blazed the trail for us by adopting a smoke-free policy at their own public housing communities. So the Housing Commission here in San Diego stepped into this very cautiously. It was a tremendous policy change taking place in a market that was, and frankly still is, in the midst of a housing crisis. We're a public sector agency, so there are optics in play. Displacement of a resident is an absolute last resort. So I'll talk in just a few slides about some of the activities we conducted during the planning and implementation process to avoid displacement and gain community support. What I really want to illustrate today with this slide is that there was an extensive planning phase for us leading up to the go live date. And Rebecca just spoke to the same there in the city of Berkeley. It took well over a year for us from the announcement to implementation. And we really just wanted to ensure that our residents had access to resources and information, or in the worst case, they had time to plan for a move in the event that they chose not to quit. So all the planning, all the preparation, it did pay off. When the program launched, it was fairly seamless and I dare say almost completely uneventful. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So I want to walk through some of the steps we took to successfully implement a smoke-free program. The initiative was kicked off with a survey to our residents, of which about 30% responded. Of that 30%, 2/3 of them indicated a fairly strong preference for a smoke-free environment. We offered a resident forum in which they could come and share more feedback and insight. I will say that the attendance was pretty minimal for that. When the survey and the engagement events concluded, we had some really good data on preferences and what the needs might look like for support. And from there, we engaged the American Lung Association for cessation services for those who requested it. Our residents were able to connect directly with the American Lung Association to learn more about tools for quitting. And several of them did, and they made the connection and started down that path and eventually quit. So all of these activities and efforts were started well ahead of our anticipated effective date, which was February 2014. We laid out marketing efforts ahead of the go live date to ensure that anyone moving in to a Housing Commission owned property knew that as of February 14th, the communities would be smoke free. So again, similar to what Rebecca said, we had a runway about a year out in which we were signing leases that stated it would become smoke free in 2014. So we had many different channels of communication, not just through leases, but we posted flyers, we had notices, we have a standalone lease addendum, which new move-ins acknowledged, and just broadcasted our smoke-free policy and all the rules surrounding it. From there, we moved into the monitoring and managing phase, which is where we are today. And that is a continuous cycle. Next slide, please. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the collaborations we had with some other partners that made this initiative so successful here. Starting first with the American Lung Association. As I mentioned, they provided cessation resources to our residents who are interested in quitting. Equally important, they provided training to our staff. So they met with our property managers. They helped the managers understand how they could serve as a conduit for the residents to access resources. So the minute a resident inquired about quitting, our team knew exactly what to do. And I think that was a large part of the success. We have another partner here in San Diego called Say San Diego. It's a community advocacy group. Many of you may recognize this in conjunction with the national program Crime Free multi-housing program. Say San Diego is our partner in that with the police department. What they did for us was really rather unexpected. They provided signage that we were able to post in a conspicuous place at all 150 plus properties that we own. So it was displayed very prominently in a very obvious location. So even visitors or guests who arrived on one of our properties who may not know any better could clearly see that this was smoke-free. I also want to mention some of the marketing that we did in ensuring that the message reached not only our residents, but also our vendors and contractors. And I'm mentioning this because this is something that was, I think, unanticipated at the front end. And as you get into implementation, things crop up that you really just didn't anticipate. So when the real life application happened, it became very apparent to us that vendors and contractors needed to be put on notice. So they were very appreciative, they were very supportive, they were very compliant. We also worked closely with our internal communications department. Some of you in the property management world will think of a marketing department. This group helped us craft all the marketing materials such as FAQs, help us create the website, flyers, all of these things that could share the information and the benefits to everyone about living and working at an SDHC property that is smoke-free. Next slide, please. So I'd like to also speak today about how we've been able to enforce this with really very minimal issue. First, we were very clear in how we defined smoking. So it includes cigarettes, pipes, cigars, it includes weed, tobacco, e-cigs, bongs, all of it. We don't allow any of it. There is no loophole that can be found. It's simply not allowed on a Housing Commission owned property. I mentioned the lease addendum. That clearly defines the policy. It clearly states what the rules and regs are surrounding this, and it gives us the legal leverage should we need it. It sets the expectation at move-in. I also want to mention that I've heard from others who went smoke-free before us that this was a bit of an oversight. So we were able to put this in place, and what we call it is the 25-foot rule. So smoking is not allowed within 25 feet of our property. We do still have a few residents who smoke, but if they wish to do so, they need to step off our property and distance at least 25 feet. And that made a difference between having the smoke drift back into the property and it not. Next slide, please. So I'm often asked about the benefit of saving money on maintenance costs. Property managers, you're all looking to showcase your expense management skills. I'm telling you it's a slam dunk, and I'm really excited to share this scenario with you that can help you calculate the financial impacts to your bottom line. We've all heard about the yellow sticky residue left in the wake of a smoking resident who has moved out of one of our apartment homes. The expenditures to turn over that unit are costly. It starts with the priming and painting, and let's face it, it's never just a paint. It's usually several coats of prime, several coats of paint. There's air scrubbing, deodorizing, blind replacement, carpet replacement, HVAC system maintenance. The list goes on and on and on. So my analysis is on the expense side of this. It doesn't even consider the revenue you might gain by attracting those who want a smoke-free community. That would be an interesting analysis. Maybe I'll do that next time. But this data on this slide was collected in 2009 by Smoke Free Housing New England. It will help illustrate the cost savings related to turning over a unit that's been smoked in versus one that has not been. And the cost difference equates to about 6 times higher. So here's what that looks like for the Housing Commission. Our units turn over at a rate of about 17% annually every year. And that comes out to about 400 units. Let's just round off and say 1,200 units have turned over in 3 years. 15% of these move-outs would have been occupied by a smoker. That average was reported by the CDC in 2015. Hopefully it's a little lower now, but for the basis of the analysis, we're going to go with 15%. So 188 units over a period of 3 years would have conceivably been units that had a smoker in them. And if we take the figures from this study, the cost to turn those units would have equated to $660,000. Now, if those units were occupied by non-smokers, the turn cost would have been $105,000. So you can do the math. That is $500,000. And that is a 3-year period. It's actually been 6 years since we've gone smoke-free. We're probably in the neighborhood of saving $1 million in that time frame. Next slide, please. So in closing, I just wanted to share that our success took a lot of engagement with the community, with our staff, with residents, vendors, partners, a lot of different people to get to this point where we are today. However, in the end, it was well worth it. We feel everyone deserves clean air. The last slide does have my email address. Feel free to jot it down and connect with me anytime. I've helped a lot of property managers over the years launch their own smoke-free programs. I'm always happy to help. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And so now we're going to open it up for questions and answers. I'm going to go ahead and introduce you quickly to Esther Schiller, who is the co-founder of the nonprofit organization Smoke Free. I'm having a major technical issue over here on my side, as you can see with the issues with the slides going crazy. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stop my share, and I'm just going to speak to you and let Esther's beautiful face show. And you can see all of our panelists here. And again, now I can see and I can tell you that Esther is, oh my goodness, the co-founder of the nonprofit organization Smoke-Free Air for Everyone. In the year 2000, SAFE was awarded a grant by the California Department of Public Health to provide information to apartment owners and industry professionals on the benefits of smoke-free policies. And so with that, I want to open up the question and answers. We don't have so much time. And so I also wanted to point out really quickly that there are a number of resources here on the slide that you can access. Let's see here. Let me see if I can share that really quickly. I can't get access to the questions. My mouse disappeared. We're all human in this virtual world. So it's been such a creative last 45 minutes for me. But I thank you all for your patience as I navigate this. So I wanted to just share really quickly these resources here for you to see before we get into our questions: the smoke-free multi-unit housing model ordinance, a resource kit, as well, and a do-it-yourself testing and referral kit. And we mentioned that we had not really planned to share these PowerPoints, but we can share a PDF of these resources, and a link to the entire recorded lecture will be made available to you. And so right now we have a number of questions that have been posed in the Q&A already. And but I wanted to give a moment or two to Esther to comment on what you've heard said already, and if you've seen any of the questions, if you would like to share anything with the group. Sorry, Esther, you need to unmute yourself. Do you see how to do that?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Got it. Okay, that's a very large order, because answering questions, there are lots of people here who are very good at answering questions. Just something more about our organization. We had funding from state of California, and as we were getting through that grant, we were also funded by Los Angeles County Tobacco Control Program. We were able to help to pass ordinances in 8 cities in LA County. We set up a website where we listed the vacancies of about 400 apartment owners who had made their property non-smoking. We also went to, or had booths at apartment association trade shows. And with those booths, we were able to talk to apartment owners and managers and just give them basic information about making a building smoke-free and how to do it. And we wrote articles for apartment association magazines, and I'm trying to think of what else we did. And we did surveys in all of those cities. We did thousands of surveys, and it was quite clear that there is this huge disconnect between apartment owners and their tenants when it comes to smoke-free housing. The tenants we found who were breathing neighbors' tobacco smoke tended to not complain for various reasons. And the landlords didn't know that they could make their property smoke-free. So here is this huge disconnect between the people who should be connecting with each other. Then we had the passage, of course, the decriminalization of marijuana. And in that law, it says, any place tobacco cannot be smoked, marijuana can also not be smoked. Now, we worked with the city of Beverly Hills, and they questioned whether they had to do that because they wanted to make medical marijuana available to be smoked. But their city attorney studied the issue and said, no, it's gotta be total. However, in the city of West Hollywood, the city attorney has taken a different position. So this is very much in motion. Finally, there is so much going on because of the pandemic. For example, I've been discovering with people calling me for help, City of LA has a moratorium on evictions. So I have tenants and landlords complaining that the building is supposed to be smoke-free, but the landlord cannot evict people who are breaking the lease because of the moratorium. And now I'm turning it over for questions.
Thanks. That was a great lead into a number of our questions, which have dealt with compliance. And so questions specifically to Rebecca about how has the level of compliance been in Berkeley, and specifically, how do you enforce these rules or even find the source once a complaint has been made?
So the number of, we've received 421 complaint forms since 2014. And out of those first initial complaint forms, we've had 5 total cases fill the requirement for possible infraction, and we've had 1 infraction written. So there could be a number of reasons why that is. When you connect infractions with a law, oftentimes people are fearful of having to pay a fine, and so they change their behavior. And so that's how many, so compliance wise, that's how many complaints we've gotten. A month, I think during the COVID time, we've gotten more monthly than we had prior to the shelter in place. I think people are spending a lot more time home, both people who smoke and people who don't. And so they're noticing secondhand smoke more often. And the second part of the question was compliant. What was the second part of the question?
Second part was whether or not you can find who is the actual culprit once a complaint's been made, or how to get people to actually stop. I think this goes also into the question of, can you evict them? And we got some other questions about, can you terminate contracts? How do you manage someone?
So when someone submits a complaint form, they identify the unit. So the person responsible for the alleged violation is a person who's registered as a tenant to that unit. So that's the responsible party for the possible violation. That's primarily how we identify the alleged violator, is by the unit that is put on the complaint form. And yeah.
All right, thank you. There's a number of questions about wanting, obviously, to see the lease. We can send that, we can potentially find some resources on some model leases and things to address that. And I see that we are also kind of we're coming to the end of our 60 minutes, and there's still many, many questions that we haven't gotten to, and I haven't been able to address the discussion in way we had hoped. We have just way too much information. And so I want to thank all of you for joining. Again, we will make sure that you have these slides and these resources made available to you, these resources here that you're seeing now. And finally, I just want to again ask you to please complete the webinar evaluation in the link in the chat, and also acknowledge again and thank our speakers, the Thirdhand Smoke Resource Center staff, the Thirdhand Smoke Resource Consortium, and the TRDRP program, and of course all of you for joining today. We had around 300 attendees, which really speaks to the interest and desire for many people to get this information and to work on these issues. So thank you all so much for your participation. And finally, be sure to follow us. And again, we will post this webinar so that you can access this information in the future, as well as write to you following it with a link and more information and answers to your questions. So be sure to follow us at our website, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And with that, our hour is up. And so I again want to thank you for joining us. And I guess we do have a few more minutes if our panelists want to stay for a minute. We could continue to address a few questions, but I wanted to be sure to acknowledge everyone's time and that we met the limit. So maybe we'll end there officially, and then we can stay on for a few more minutes and answer a few more of the questions, if that sounds okay, Georg. Does that sound okay?
Okay.
Okay, thank you. So one of the other questions, it says, what can a tenant do if the non-smoking unit's lease includes a clause that the landlord does not have to guarantee a non-smoking environment? So again, it's a non-smoking apartment, but in reality, there's the presence of third-hand smoke. Something we can do?
There's really nothing.
Nothing. That's why we need to have effective, well-written leases without the loopholes.
Right, so even if, this is Rebecca speaking, even if you have a lease that had an exemption, even if there was a lease that was made in Berkeley in 1980 and it said you can smoke, this supersedes that. So even if you have a lease that you signed as of April 2014, you can't smoke in your unit regardless of what your lease says, right? And so your lease says you don't have to wear a seatbelt, but the state of California says you do. That overrides the actual lease language.
All right, great. And then one other question, maybe to you, Georg, is I've seen a number of questions. We already had decided that we weren't really going to be able to address remediation. It's just too complex and really not a viable option, so we work on prevention. But there's been some questions about how do we know it's present and can we test for it?
Good question.
So those are very good questions. And I ask everybody who is interested in this issue to reach out to us via email. We're currently in the process of developing a test kit. We have some funding through the Thirdhand Smoke Resource Center to conduct analyses in our laboratory here at San Diego State. And we would like to assist under certain conditions in piloting and field testing these kits. They currently involve either a surface wipe, that is a cotton roll that is being wiped over a surface, or a silicone wristband to pick up volatile compounds in the air. And we would hope that this can be or can become a method to help identify units that are in need of remediation, and can be part of a process to work with property owners towards creating units that are third-hand smoke-free.
Okay, I see a couple more I'm going to go after. I'm going to stick with you, Georg, for just another minute. And it asks about third-hand smoke cannabis, from cannabis and also from vaping. Do these same issues apply in terms of health? And then maybe broaden that out to Jennifer and Rebecca in the sense of, does it also apply to the policies? And Esther also referred to that already a bit.
So cannabis, of course, is a plant, and when the plant is lit and burns and smolders, we have similar chemistry happening as with tobacco. The big exception is that some of the chemical constituents differ, but the vast majority are actually the result of burning the plant product. So the indoor air pollution issues for cannabis are very similar to tobacco smoke. If this is done day after day, week after week for longer periods of time, this will accumulate in indoor environments and create this cannabis residue in apartments. For vaping involves not combustion, but heating. It creates aerosols, very similar to the aerosols that are created in tobacco smoke. It may not have all the volatile gases, and it does not have all of the combustion-related chemical compounds. But we know from laboratory studies and field studies that vaping day after day in and out leads to the accumulation of these aerosols, droplets on surfaces and in dust. And so over time, we will have very similar issues. The chemical composition of these of this residue will differ, but in the long run, we'll have very similar issues.
Okay. I have another question, a couple questions that I wanted to push back to Rebecca. And it specifically is referring to how this is perhaps a barrier or challenging specifically for vulnerable populations. And also if tenants, for example, subsidies can be terminated, or how we manage lower income occupants in this case.
Right. And so with our ordinance in general, we firmly believe in the city of Berkeley that everyone has a right to clean air, and it's a health equity issue. So when we're looking at marginalized communities, communities of color, marginalized communities who have other cofactors, comorbidities, we want to take that in consideration. And so the primary enforcement of the ordinance is to encourage people to eliminate secondhand smoke in the multi-unit housing site, right? So they can go away off property to consume, but they just can't expose others to the toxins, right? And so for us, for example, the connection of an infraction, people can fill out a hard ship waiver, so we're not there to make money. We need there to be a behavioral change. We need people to recognize that the cancer-causing chemicals are not allowed in multi-unit housing in Berkeley. And if anything, we're trying to support marginalized communities and the psychosocial stressors that influence tobacco use by providing them with free stop smoking classes. So really looking at how we can support all our Berkeley residents, the residents who choose to smoke and the residents who do not and who are being exposed to the cancerous chemicals, by offering services to the people who smoke and ensuring that the people who don't smoke do not have to inhale secondhand smoke without consent.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you guys. We went 5 minutes over. That was a great questions there that we were able to fit in. There's still a handful of questions that we can respond to in an email to the participants. A number of the questions deal with remediation and the length of the efforts and how long it needs to last. So maybe perhaps you can again just emphasize an answer to that, Georg, in conclusion, of why we are working on prevention and what the issues are with remediation.
Sure. We just last month published the first study on remediating third-hand smoke polluted homes. And the little summary I gave during the presentation, I think already pointed out that the benefits are temporary in most cases. And the reason for this, of course, is that third-hand smoke, and you now understand the properties better, consists of this multitude of different chemicals. They move around in an indoor environment because they're carried by either fine and ultrafine droplets and particles that get into everything, or gases that can be absorbed into drywall and carpeting and furniture and ceiling tiles and everything else. So the remediation part, the success of remediation really depends on the depth of the reservoir, the amount of third-hand smoke residue that has become embedded in an apartment. If there was just light smoking or short-term smoking, it may be possible to wash and vacuum off and wipe off residue because it has not yet penetrated. But in cases where the reservoirs are deep, removing the carpet might be a first step, but there is material underneath the carpet. Painting on top of a residue on paint may be a temporary fix, but the residue that's inside the wallboard will eventually come out. So in these cases, we have a much bigger task in front of us that really requires ripping out drywall, replacing furniture, etc. I want to draw your attention to a brief video that was prepared by the crew of This Old House, the PBS home remodeling show. They address the question of how can you get rid of third-hand smoke. And they have some great illustrations and some great tips, but also some great warnings for the expenses that can be incurred if there is an entire remodel that has to take place, because the third-hand smoke became, over years of smoking, so embedded in an indoor environment.
One of the important things to keep in mind, if you're looking for an apartment or a condo, don't buy it without going there. You need to smell the air.
Okay, thank you. Well, we've gone over everybody so much, and if our questions weren't answered, your question wasn't answered, you can always reach out to us at the Thirdhand Smoke Resource Center, and we'll respond, and we'll also make an effort to put in some of these responses in our follow-up email. So thank you all so much for spending an hour and 15 minutes of your day with us today, and we wish you all good luck in your efforts to ensure clean air and clean, safe indoor environments for all Californians. Thank you, speakers.
Thank you, Heather.